Along the western shore of the Dead Sea, amid the vast and unforgiving wilderness of Judea, we find a precipitous plateau isolated by millions of years of erosion that turned it into an impregnable fortress. The Hebrew word for fortress is Masada, by which it is still called to this day. Its greatest claim to fame derives from events that transpired at the end of the Great Revolt against Rome, when for 3 brave years, 70 to 73 CE, the freedom fighters on this ancient Gibraltar, known as the Sicarii, managed to hold off 10,000 Roman troops armed with every contemporary siege weapon. Finally, a battering ram breached the wall. Masada was originally fortified by the kings of the Hasmonean dynasty, but it was King Herod the Great who masterminded the amazing structures still visible. Herod, it's been observed, enjoyed confounding nature, erecting sumptuous palaces in barren wastelands, and Masada was perhaps his most ambitious. Ancient Jewish historian Josephus Flavius describes the only approaches. It could only be reached by 2 narrow and difficult paths, from Lake Asphaltis on the east and from the hills to the west. The former they call the snake, since it resembles a reptile in its narrow windings back and forth along breathtaking precipices until it finally reaches a plain at the summit on which Masada stood. The snake path could only be climbed in a single file line while under constant threat from above. Herod surrounded the entire summit with a casemate wall, honeycombed with individual rooms, also described by Josephus. He also built a wall around about the entire top of the hill, 7 furlongs long. It was composed of white stone. Its height was 12, and its breadth 8 cubits. There were also erected upon that wall 38 towers, each of them 50 cubits high, out of which you might pass into lesser edifices, which were built on the inside, round the entire wall. In order to provide sufficient water in such a barren setting, Herod had 2 rows of cisterns cut into the rock face above the ravine, known in Arabic as a wadi, running along the northwest side of the plateau. During the rainy season, dams collected the water, which flowed via an aqueduct into the cisterns. These cisterns held roughly 40,000 cubic meters of water. When it came to Herod's accommodations on Masada, the most incredible was the so-called hanging palace built into the north end of the rock at 3 levels. The upper level rested on the summit, while the other 2 levels were on steps down the cliff face. They were accessed by spiraling square staircases. While the foundations of the 2 upper levels are still discernible, only the lowest level remains sufficiently intact to attempt an accurate reconstruction. There are, in fact, enough remains to reconstruct even the decorations of the main building, which look similar to the famous Roman city of Pompeii, engulfed in the 1st century by lava from Mount Vesuvius. There were flat panels of color interspersed with panels painted to look like marble. There was also a colonnaded court with a small private bathhouse attached. Here, under a thick layer of debris, were found the remains of 3 skeletons of a man, a woman, and a child. The beautifully braided hair of the woman was preserved, and her sandals were found intact next to her. Also, hundreds of small bronze scales of the man's armor, probably booty taken from the Romans. In addition to the hanging palace, there was an even larger royal accommodation in the middle of the west side of the plateau. The southeast portion of this imposing structure consisted of the royal quarters. To the right were storerooms, and in the northwest wing were an assortment of kitchens and workshops. Opposite them was an administrative building. While the decoration is not as well preserved as in the Hanging Palace, 2 elaborate mosaic floors, almost intact, were uncovered in the area of Herod's private bathhouses. They're Greco-Roman in style and are the best preserved rooms in the palace. The changing room with a fine mosaic leads off to a small tepidarium or warm room. That in turn leads to a caldarium or hot room featuring a bath set into an alcove at the far end. A furnace behind the bath heated both the room and the water. A flight of steps on the opposite side of the changing room descend to a cold plunge bath. The furniture also of the edifices and of the cloisters and of the baths was of great variety and very costly, and these buildings were supported by pillars of single stones on every side. The walls and also the floors of the edifices were paved with stones of several colors. He also had cut many and great pits as reservoirs for water out of the rocks at every one of the places that were inhabited, both above and round about the palace and before the wall. And by this contrivance he endeavored to have water for several uses, as if there had been fountains there. Near 2 of Herod's bathtubs is an enclosure whose inside walls are dotted with square holes. Believe it or not, this was a large desert swimming pool, and the holes were lockers for bathers' clothes. A public bathhouse, probably built for Herod's foreign visitors, was situated immediately behind the Hanging Palace. It resembles Herod's other bath complexes at both Herodium and Jericho. The decoration in the changing room and tepidarium are particularly well preserved. We also find a boiler room where the bathwater was heated. Hot air from the furnace was drawn under the floor of the caldarium, which was raised on small columns, a hypocaust system. Behind the wall plaster are the remains of clay pipes which conveyed the hot air up the walls in order to heat the whole room. There were also 3 other buildings that might be described as palaces, and which may have been residences for Herod's own family and his wife's family, who so despised each other that they had to be kept separate. Elsewhere on Masada were found the remains of 2 mikvaot, which, in order to be kosher, had to be at least partly filled with pure rainwater. Remains have been found of the channel for the rainwater, the water tank, and a pool for washing hands and feet before bathing, in addition to the actual bath. We also have at Masada one of the most ancient synagogues in Israel. When the Sicarii took over the place at the outset of the Great Revolt, they may have converted an earlier structure, adding masonry benches along the walls and a room at the rear to house scrolls of the Torah. But it's also possible that it was a synagogue to begin with, when the Hasmoneans first occupied the site, and only modified by the Sicarii. Of course, Herod would have had no interest whatsoever in a synagogue. So, how could it have been a synagogue in his day? Therein lies the mystery. In any case, an ostracon bearing the inscription Me'aser Kohen, tithe for the priest, was found inside the synagogue, along with fragments of 2 scrolls from Deuteronomy and Ezekiel 37. The famous dry bones passage. Interestingly, the Masada synagogue is similar in form to one uncovered at Herodium, which had been Herod's dining room until the Zealots occupied the site. Yet neither of the synagogues faces Jerusalem. Along the outer wall of the complex, not far from the synagogue, the excavations uncovered a number of badly mangled scroll fragments, including portions of the apocryphal book of Ben Sirah and a mystical text known as the Songs of Sabbath Sacrifices. The only other copy of this work known to exist in the world was found among the Cave 4 fragments at Qumran. It was thus suggested that a group of Dead Sea sectarians, presumably the Essenes, must have fled their community in advance of the Romans and joined the radical sect of Sicarii on top of Masada. Other artifacts recovered from Masada include imported jugs or amphoras, one broken shard of which mentions King Herod by name. Also found were assorted molded radial oil lamps from the 1st century. But the most controversial of all discoveries was an assortment of ostraka, or inscribed broken potsherds bearing Hebrew names. One of them reads, Ben Yair, the commander of the Sicarii, who for months at the end of the Great Revolt held off the Roman juggernaut. Josephus relates what he claims to have been the actual words of the rebel leader.
Long ago we decided to serve neither Roman nor anyone else except God. And now the time has come to verify that resolution by action. We who were the first to revolt and are the last in arms against the Romans must not disgrace ourselves by letting our wives die dishonored and our children enslaved. We still have the free choice of a noble death with those we hold dear. When they are gone, let us render a generous service to each other. Life, not death, is man's misfortune, for death liberates the soul from its imprisonment in a mortal body. Why then should we fear death, who welcome the calm of sleep? Let us die as free men with our wives and children, and deny the Romans their joy of victory. Let us rather strike them with amazement at our brave death.
Josephus relates what happens next. While they embraced their wives and took their children in their arms, clinging in tears to their parting kisses, they killed them. When all were put to death, they gathered together their effects and set fire to them. Then they chose by lot 10 of their number to kill the rest. They lay down beside their dead wives and children, and flinging their arms around them, offered their throats to those who had slaughtered them all. The 10 then cast lots, and he on whom it fell killed the other 9. He then looked about to see that all were dead, set fire to the place, and finally drove his sword through his body, falling beside his family. 2 women and 5 children, however, escaped by hiding in an underground aqueduct during the massacre. The victims numbered 960. Was the account true? Another archaeological testimony is the Roman ramp that still rises almost to the summit at the center of the western face of the fortress. It was by this that the Romans hauled their siege engines to the very top and pounded down the walls, only to be greeted by an awful silence that hung over the place. After these horrific events, the site lay abandoned for 19 long centuries until Yigael Yadin, archaeologist and former Israel Army Chief of Staff, undertook major excavations from 1963 to 1965. Many of the ancient buildings have been restored from their remains, as have the wall paintings of Herod's 2 main palaces, as well as his Roman-style bathhouses. Restoration work was also done on the synagogues, storehouses, and houses of the Jewish rebels. The meter-high wall that the Romans built around Masada can still be seen, together with 11 barracks for the Roman soldiers just outside this wall. Most haunting were the skeletal remains of 28 people unearthed at Masada. The sparse remains of another 24 people were found in a cave at the base of the cliff. Although Yigael Yadin was unsure of their ethnicity, the rabbinical establishment concluded that they were remains of the Jewish defenders. And in 1969, they were reburied as Jews in a state cemetery. But pig bones were also present, occasionally used in Roman burials due to pig sacrifices. And that may well indicate that the remains belong to non-Jewish Roman soldiers or civilians who occupied the site before or after the siege, which means that the wrong people may have been buried in the Jewish cemetery. Other issues have surfaced as well. As Harvard professor Shai Cohen has observed, if, as Josephus says, the Romans found 960 corpses in the palace, they would not have dragged 24 of them across the plateau in order to lower them carefully into a cave located on a slope where one false step meant death. The obvious and simple procedure for the Romans was to take the corpses out of the palace and toss them over the nearest cliff. Pig bones notwithstanding, the 24 skeletons in the cave might have been the remains of Jews who attempted to hide from the Romans, but were discovered and killed. Or did they commit suicide? At the very least, archaeology reveals that Josephus' narrative is incomplete and inaccurate. Was anything Josephus wrote the truth? Did the Sicarii commit suicide? Did the Romans discover corpses when they arrived at the summit? Some suggest that the Sicarii were captured by the Romans and massacred, or that they fought the Romans and were killed, and that Josephus, whose fondness for literary commonplaces and types is well known, substituted a collective suicide story for the truth. Perhaps. These conjectures can be neither verified nor refuted, but we may readily believe that the Josephus story has a basis in fact. First, it is plausible. Many Jews committed suicide during the crucial moments of the war of 66 to 70 CE. Second, the Masada story is too complex to be dismissed as a literary fiction. Why should Josephus have invented such a story? The Sicarii did not have to commit suicide to make their point clear. Death in battle would have served just as well. We might conclude, then, that Josephus attempted to be reasonably accurate in matters which were verifiable by the Romans. He refrained from inventing glorious military actions for the Sicarii, and we may assume had some basis in fact for ascribing murder-suicide to them. At least some of the Sicarii must have killed themselves rather than face the Romans. This fact was exaggerated and embellished, but in the eyes of many scholars, a fact nonetheless. But as with so many other archaeological issues, the jury remains out, and such questions remain open. In the final analysis, archaeology can reveal incredible detail, not only of the monumental structures of antiquity and the historical mysteries surrounding them, but of the daily lives of those who inhabited them, from kings and potentates to house servants and slaves. The unconsidered trifles from each archaeological dig indeed speak volumes. Yet archaeology cannot derive meaning from what it uncovers. It's up to us to find the lessons, knowing that those who fail to learn from the mistakes of the past are condemned to repeat them. 2 millennia ago, the site fell victim to the Judean desert, which slowly and relentlessly reclaimed it. Yet today, the lonely desert fortress has been reborn, its rugged outlines standing sentinel against the deep blue sky. The excavated plateau reminds us of many things: the error of misplaced faith, the danger of militant fanaticism, but also the desire, above all, of a people called Israel to live in freedom in their own land. The English poet Percy Bysshe Shelley might as well have been writing of the ruin of Masada when he penned these classic verses. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.